We are now going to transition into our 8th and final week of our Convictions and Practices series. I played softball in college, and college athletics is a very weird world. I don't know if any of you have been part of it. You get people who have devoted their entire lives, every waking moment, from childhood to college years, playing one sport, one position, and they finally are like at the pinnacle of their athletic venture, especially if you play softball. There's not like many places to go once you are done in college, because we have like a national team, and that's it. So there aren't like many professional aims for softball players specifically. And then you get people like me who played like pretty casually and just sort of happened to play in college, luckily. It was sort of happenstance, which I'm very grateful for. But either way, in athletics, no matter what sport you play, you will find some very, very superstitious people. Some of my teammates wore the same socks all season. Disgusting. Some of them tapped their bats on their shoes or on the plate a very specific number of times every time they went up to the plate to bat. Some of them ate the exact same thing on game days. Some of them maintained the same schedule, only talked to the same people. I think I changed my superstitions and rituals every single season. I don't think that I really cared all that much, but I felt like I needed to have some sort of habit that I did every time. Well, it's really easy for us to kind of scoff at this sort of thing. Some of us grew up in traditions where these kind of things were actually discouraged. Superstitions were discouraged because it was considered dangerous to dabble in them, no matter how harmless they might seem. People thought it was a gateway to some kind of spiritual realm that could be dangerous. I tend to sort of laugh it off a little bit. Like in college, I was sort of like, well, yeah, I'll just do this too. That's fine. It feels silly eventually, sometimes. But outside of my athletic experience, I have run into adults in adulthood who practice some very similar superstitions, not with sports, but with their own spirituality. They wouldn't call them superstitions. They would probably call them spiritual practices or just being a very spiritual person, but they treat them very much like superstitions. You might be inclined to think this way, and I don't want to be discouraging of you whatsoever. I don't mean to make fun or be insensitive. I simply want to call out the fact that there are personality types that tend towards superstitious spirituality, and that can be unhealthy if it's not examined or kept in check. I'll give you an example. There have been a few times in my life when something bad happens to me or around me, and I automatically assume that it happened because I wasn't a very good Christian. I hadn't prayed in a while, or I hadn't been paying closer attention in church. Maybe I hadn't been reading my Bible like I was supposed to. And I would attribute whatever happened to me to my spiritual behaviors or lack thereof. This is a really easy mindset to get into, and as I just said, I can be this way too, despite being a normally rational human being most of the time. Sometimes we treat God like a genie in a bottle. There's a certain ritual or there are code words that will activate this genie, and then we will get to enjoy the benefits. But you do the wrong thing, or you say something in the wrong way, and maybe we upset God. Or worse, we have activated some kind of evil spirit. This way of thinking is alive and well among Christians all over the world. Again, I don't mean to make fun of anybody here. I find myself thinking this way sometimes too, so I know very well how easy it is to get sucked into this type of transactional and superstitious spirituality. The fact is, part of why we think this way is because our faith originated in a time when the majority of the world also thought this way. And the text we rely on most, the Bible, the revelation of God to humanity, was written during eras where mystical thinking and superstition ruled people's thoughts. This all took place before rationalism and the Enlightenment and the industrialization and scientific method all broke through and changed the way that human beings thought. The mystic way of thinking is at the root and core of our faith, and our most reliable and utilized document for spiritual guidance was written in eras that subscribed to this type of thinking. It's no surprise then that it's the way we tend to think sometimes. But all Christians believe in the supernatural, even if not the superstitious. We believe in God, who is spirit in substance and invisible to us, because God is transcendent of time and space. We believe in a creation narrative of some kind. We believe in concepts like heaven and hell. We believe in spiritual warfare and spirits that are not God. We believe that humans are made up not just of flesh and blood and bone, but also of a soul. I know I just listed some things that you probably don't think about, or that describe a way of thinking that isn't aligned with yours. When I say we, I mean Christians generally. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that everyone in here believes in a God or a spiritual authority of some kind. So we all, or most of us, believe in some level of supernatural, spiritual, non-tangible, non-rational, non-scientifically provable thing. So how do we engage this supernatural, spiritual thing without becoming superstitious or too mystical in our thinking? How do we engage this spirituality with the guardrails of rationality? Well, I'm sure you won't be surprised when I tell you that Paul has some thoughts on what to do with the supernatural movement of God, and also some guardrails for engaging the supernatural. He has a lot to say on a lot of things, so this shouldn't be all that surprising. In chapter 14 of his first letter to the church in Corinth, he lays out a bunch of guidance for how to practice things like tongues and prophecy and worship. At one point, he says this: when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. The overall sentiment of the entire chapter is this: your worship is chaotic. Tidy it up a bit. Your worship is creating hierarchy and superiority. Make sure it edifies and equalizes. Your worship exploits. Change it so it encourages. In essence, don't let the supernatural devolve into superstition. In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes this at the beginning of chapter 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. In the first text, worship is edifying and orderly. In the second, worship is humble and self-sacrificing. There's a lot more that Paul has to say about worship, but we've tried to take these two sentiments and apply them to our worship experiences on Sunday mornings. How do we make room for true worship without sliding into superstition? Well, allow me to introduce you to what the church has called for centuries sacraments, which walks us into our fourth and final spiritual practice of this series. There are proper noun sacraments and adjectival sacraments. We're not going to get into a grammar lesson, as much as I think that might be fun. So the first one, proper nouns, we will call them big S sacraments. These are established by Jesus and for the church to utilize as a special means of grace. The second type, the little s sacraments, are ways in which we connect with the presence and power of God. I'll expound more on that one in just a minute. For us, the big S sacraments, the ones that we see Jesus doing, are baptism and communion. Here's our fourth practice. I'm going to read it to us. We are sacramental. We engage in the sacraments of communion and baptism as historical and embodied acts of worship that lead us Godward. Our weekly liturgy is made up of songs, prayers, teaching, contemplation, and more. But these sacraments represent the core of our belief in practice. In our weekly practice of communion, we celebrate and remember the unconditional love of God. In baptism, we welcome people into the family of God by the application of water, a symbolic and special means of God's grace. So the two sacraments, baptism, there are two different kinds. There are pedo and credo. We practice both of those, and I'll mention those a little bit later. And then communion, which is a celebration of the love of God through bread and wine. Both use physical, ordinary elements, whether that be water or bread and wine or juice, as a means of grace. That's what sacrament means, a practice or an apparatus that channels God's grace uniquely. In the Catholic faith, you have, I believe, 7 different sacraments, which is really kind of a cool thing when you think about the definition of them. But 5 of them don't meet that criteria that I just talked about, being explicitly implemented by Jesus. Therefore, most Protestants don't recognize those 5. I don't want to delegitimize them whatsoever. I'm just giving you a little bit of context about why we don't see those outside of the Catholic Church. Catholics and Protestants have a very different criteria for sacraments. But if practices that connect humans with the presence and power of God are sacramental, small s, then there are a lot more sacramental practices than just baptism and communion. That is to say, when we expand our conversation about sacramentalism beyond the big S sacraments, we discover many practices that can accomplish something similar. We describe these as sacramental. We're about to enter the season of Lent, which is a time to experiment with different spiritual practices. Here are a few that people have chosen from over the years: musical worship, fasting, prayer, silence, stillness, solitude, generosity, gratitude, abstaining from certain foods or beverages. In Lent, we give up and we take up. We give up what distracts us from God's presence and power, and we take up what connects us to and helps us experience God's presence and power. These are sacramental in that they help us connect to God, or they remove barriers to that end. They aren't the established big S sacraments we mentioned a moment ago, but they're no less effective in accomplishing spiritual growth. Plus, the big S sacraments are communal, and many of these other ones are individual, or at least can be. That's another way for you to understand what it means to be sacramental. Consider communal sacramental practices and individual ones. We have an opportunity to practice several of these types of things every single week, including communion. But baptism is a little bit more elusive, and for many, it only happened one time in their life, and then it was over. Occasionally, someone will want to be rebaptized for various reasons, but usually 2 times is the most that people get baptized. So by nature, these happen much less frequently. We host a couple of infant baptisms per year alongside our infant dedications. Depending on your tradition and your theological convictions, you might prefer that for your children. But what about adults or older consenting children? Well, for them, we host an occasional baptism by immersion, or what's called credo baptism. This is the kind where faith in Jesus has already been professed, and baptism is a response to that. It swaps the order of the sacrament and the initiation of faith in contrast with the way infant baptism functions. It is traditional for new Christians or new again Christians to spend the season of Lent preparing for their baptism or rebaptism. Since Lent is just around the corner, we would love to offer that to you as well. We are going to change up Eastertide happy hours this year, not too drastically, so don't worry. If you don't know what those are, every Sunday in Eastertide we get together and we share some things that we're grateful for, and then we have a toast with one another. Really short, really simple, but it's become one of my favorite little practices during Eastertide. Well, the first one, we're not going to host at the Englewood Grand like we normally do. We're going to host it in the Hoeg's backyard. And one of the reasons for this is that we would love to do a baptism for our first happy hour the Sunday after Easter. And the Hoegs have a hot tub, which we have historically done baptisms in, believe it or not. We think that this is a beautiful way for us to celebrate the resurrection together. There is a really, really simple interest form if you're curious about this for you or for your child. There is no commitment or pressure by filling that form out. We will collect the responses, and odds are Nathan will be the one to respond to you and give you a little bit more about what to expect. And then the two of you can kind of meet up and prepare together as you sit through Lent together for your baptism, like Christians have done for centuries. That form is linked in our QR code. You can scan it on your way out, and it will also be up on our website. It's not up there yet, so don't look for it today. Probably tomorrow. This series has been a really beautiful way to start our year out. It's been long. It's been 8 weeks, but you have trudged through with us. We have talked about theology. We have talked about spiritual practices. We have stirred up dialogue and even some controversy, more so than I think I anticipated. We have utilized these topics as a springboard for your spiritual health and growth. Here are the different topics that we have discussed. I don't have these written down, so I'm going to need, perfect. In the first part of our series, we talked about our theological convictions. We talked about who is God, what is the Bible, what did Jesus accomplish, and what is the purpose of humanity. In the last 4 weeks, we have been talking about our spiritual practices. We are responsible, we are generous, we are communal, and we are sacramental. If you've watched gymnastics in the Olympics or any of the videos that Nathan and Julie post when Mia is at her meets, which I think I watch every single one of them, you will know that for the vault, there is a springboard just before the vault table that maximizes the momentum that the gymnast uses from their speed. This is an adapted illustration that Nathan wrote. He has much more experience in this. Although I've watched the Olympic gymnastics every time that I could. Well, the vault skills are up to the gymnast specifically. The safety is up to them, but the springboard is there to maximize their momentum. Coaches are also there to spot, to offer feedback, and to create a context in which the gymnasts can perform safely and to their highest potential. This series, we want you to view as the springboard for your vault. We are here to coach you, to spot you, to help you maximize your spiritual potential. Our convictions and practices are a springboard to get you going. But the continuation of this work is up to you. No one can grow spiritually for you. People can help, and that's what we're here for, but you have to keep the momentum going. It has been such an honor to explore these things with you, and I can't wait to see how they keep going this year. Here's what I'll challenge you to do as we wrap up. Take some time in the next few days to prepare for Lent, which starts this coming Wednesday with Ash Wednesday. What sacramental practices can you take up? What distractions can you give up? Will you participate in baptism in Eastertide? Will you commit to being here in Eastertide to experience communion regularly? We would love that. The reason I mention Eastertide for communion is that we practice a communal fast from communion throughout Lent. In doing so, we create a longing, a craving for that spiritual connection that we get to reinstitute in a huge celebratory manner on Easter Sunday. I don't want that to catch you off guard next week when there is no communion, so I wanted to mention it now. We're glad you're with us on this journey. It has been a pretty wild ride. It is a wild ride. And there are going to be times where you probably want to get off or you want it to slow down. Well, let me encourage you to hang on as best you can. We're on this journey towards rediscovering faith and following the way of Jesus together, and we want you along for all of it. Let's pray.